The Lord be with you. Last week we saw Jesus in action, responding with healing to the faith of a sick man and revealing that he was prepared to get down and dirty in the cause of the healing and wholeness that are part of God's kingdom by touching a leper. Mark's early chapters are about the revealing of the strong Son of God. Notice what happened next. Jesus told the man, "Don't tell anyone." St. John's Gospel might have added, "My hour has not yet come." But the man told everyone, and Jesus became a target for any and every sufferer. He couldn't go into a town without crowds gathering. That's chapter 1. Yet today we're on chapter 9. Because next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent and thinking about Jesus' journey to the cross. But first, we must turn to chapter 8, reading from verse 27. Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" They said, "Some say Elijah. Some say John the Baptist. Some say one of the prophets." And then came the killer question, "And you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurted out, "You are God's anointed one." In Hebrew, that's Messiah. In Greek, that's Christ. In the understanding of the time, that's the coming king who will destroy Israel's enemies and rule, having cleansed the temple, reign over a redeemed holy nation. Jesus' reply again is, "Don't tell anyone." The time will come when he is to reveal himself, but for the moment this is a secret between him and the disciples. And then Jesus adds something unexpected. The Son of Man must be rejected by the chief priests, the scribes and the elders, and be put to death, and to rise again on the third day. And Mark emphasizes this. He adds, "He said this plainly." Peter exercised his tenacious grip of the wrong end of the stick. He denies that anything like this could possibly happen. To which says, "Out of my sight, Satan. You think as men think, not as God thinks." Jesus has arrived at a crisis. Even those closest to him fail to understand him, and they are actively opposing him. Moses experienced the same situation. Having confronted Pharaoh and brought his people out of Egypt, he climbed the mountain of God, and he returned with laws to enable this rabble of freed slaves to become a holy nation, the people of God. And he found them worshipping a pagan god, a golden calf. Moses had to go back up the mountain to plead for God to forgive the people and to see God from behind. Much of the same happened to Elijah. He destroyed the pagan priests of King Ahab's queen Jezebel and ran for his life as Jezebel swore vengeance. Elijah climbed the mountain of God and, like Moses, saw God from behind. He received instructions to anoint a righteous new king to replace Ahab, and he received Elisha as a disciple to continue his work. And now Jesus faced disappointment. After 3 years of work, all that the people wanted were healing and feeding, and his disciples seemed to see him as a power politician. So Jesus took his 3 closest apostles, Peter, James and John, up a mountain. Mountains were seen as places to meet gods. On this mountain, the disciples finally saw Jesus as he really is. Mark says his clothes became dazzling white, like the clothes of the one that the prophet Daniel saw, on the one sitting on a throne, judging the nations. And with Jesus stood the 2 greatest prophets of Israel, Moses the lawgiver and Elijah the defender of true faith. Mark doesn't say what they were talking about, but Luke says they were talking about Jesus' departure, the destiny that he would fulfill at Jerusalem. So this moment of glory is under the shadow of the cross. Peter, of course, didn't get it. He wanted to build a monument. Notice that he called Jesus Rabbi instead of Master. He still hadn't got the point. What Jesus was about was the new kingdom of God, in accordance with the scriptures, not the old kingdom of kings and rabbis. We're not so very different. We build huge buildings and put up statues and stained glass windows. However valuable and beautiful they are, and most churches are, we mustn't have a building-centred faith, as the Jews of the Second Temple did. On arrival in Jerusalem, Jesus closed down the temple. He didn't just cleanse it, he closed it down for a few minutes. Mark is scornful here. He says that Peter didn't know what to say, for they were terrified. And just as Peter suffers an attack of foot-in-mouth disease, a cloud covers them. It wasn't the natural cloud that enveloped me at the top of Mount Snowdon. I saw the view from the top for at least half a minute. Here the gospel echoes the book of Exodus. A pillar of cloud went with the Israelites across the desert. It was a sign of God's presence. And from the cloud here comes a voice. It's the same voice Jesus heard at his baptism, saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." But this time, the voice isn't only for Jesus. It's for the disciples and for us. "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Church buildings are useful. They can serve the community and they can enable worship of real depth. But the most important thing is to listen to Jesus. So the vision ends, and Jesus leads the trio down the mountain, leaving behind any chance of staying at the top. Once more, Jesus wants the apostles to be discreet. They're not to tell anyone until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And that starts a big discussion. Jesus says he is to endure great suffering and be treated with contempt, just as Elijah was. This is repeated in verse 31 and later on the road to Jerusalem. Mark describes millions of Christians in verse 32. They did not understand what he said, and they were afraid to ask. So where do we go from here? A happy ending would be lovely. Alas, we can't stay on our modern mountaintops. COVID has temporarily taken away our temple. Jesus must deal with a serious sickness beyond the disciples' ability. And then in Jerusalem, the powerful will reject him and murder him. We can't live in a holy huddle and avoid encountering a wounded and hurting world in which the sin of greed what St. Paul called idolatry, is built into our way of life. One result of endemic greed is our exploiting and abusing the natural world, extracting more and more and pumping out more and more waste, so that climate change is putting the poorest into very real danger, while the richest do the most damage. We are called to follow Jesus, just as Peter, James and John and the other 9 were. And that means facing and confronting the evils that I've just mentioned. It implies hostile criticism when we speak for justice and the requirements of God's rule. For many of our worldwide Christian family, there is already active state-sponsored persecution. Even in England, bishops and other clergy are attacked for mixing politics and religion, as if faith has nothing to say about the meaning of the command to love one's neighbour. At a time of pandemic devastating us, it's good to see churches leading in binding communities together, especially rescuing those who can't afford the basics. We can't say, "I'm saved," and then live in a dream world as if our eternal salvation has no present consequences. We can't earn salvation, but we do have to live out its meaning. I'll finish with 2 things. The first from St. John's Gospel, as near as I can to a happy ending. Jesus said, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." And from today's Gospel, God says, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him."